I move on to the uses for the higher grade paints, I want to explain my uses of the terms craft, mixed media, and fine art. I do not want anyone to think that I'm giving any type of work a lesser status than another. I do them all. I simply refer to them by different names for clarity of the different types of techniques and materials used. I absolutely think craft and mixed media are fine arts, but I have come to define the way I create each by different names. Crafts are items with some utilitarian use that needs to be considered during the creation. A painted box, a knitted sweater, a flower arrangement. Mixed media to me is more relaxed than fine art. I can use whatever materials I want, like the craft paints. To me, finished mixed media work can range anywhere from doodles in an art journal to wall-size abstract pieces suitable for a gallery showing. Fine art, as a practice to me, is more refined and constrained, not in subject matter, but in skills, materials, and techniques used. When I think of creating fine art, I consider the longevity and quality of the materials, and often use more traditional and academic methods of composition and creation. So when I use these three terms, I'm talking about how I get to the finished product. In all cases, the finished products can be considered art. Absolutely, 100%. I wanted to clarify because I know that the distinctions can be controversial to some people. So I want to be clear, I see no distinction in the final pieces. All creative works are art to me. I use the terms to define the skills I use to get to that finished product, and I wanted to clarify the terms here since I will be using them a lot. Okay, now to move on to what I consider fine art uses for acrylic paints. These are techniques that you will want to use at least the student or studio grade paints for. When working on fine art pieces, you want high quality pigments that mix and behave predictably. For the watercolor technique, the highest quality paint you can afford is recommended because the better quality of the paint, the smoother and less grainy it'll look when it's watered down. Oops. And I use the golden, when I'm doing a watercolor technique, I use the golden liquids. They give me the best results. The three ways we're going to look at for using acrylic paint are as a watercolor type paint, using a glazing method, and as impasto. As I discuss these and show you examples, we will also discuss some of the acrylic mediums and substrates you can use. Using acrylics as watercolor is really not that much different than using regular watercolors. The biggest difference is that once the paint has dried, it is permanent and cannot be blended any further. This can be a benefit in that you don't need to worry about ruining the finished part of a piece by getting it wet. It can also be a negative in that blending edges and washes can be more difficult. Acrylics do dry fairly quickly, so learning to work within the time frame of the paint is an important skill no matter how you are using the acrylics. I'm just going to demonstrate here. I did these earlier so they could dry. And you can see I extremely wet paintbrush here. And it doesn't affect the paint at all because it's totally dry. It's not going anywhere. So to use acrylics as watercolor, let me get my sample that I'm going to paint. So to use acrylics as watercolor, you add water to a small amount. You can use a watercolor palette too. Drop it red here. Actually, let me do yellow first. Okay. Add water to a small amount of paint till it reaches the right consistency for you. So I'm just going to water this down. See, that's very watery. If you were doing it as solid acrylic, you wouldn't want it that watery. And if you're making the lighter you want your wash, the more water you add. The stronger you want your colors, the less water you add. And the allure of using watercolors is their transparency. So in order to maintain that when using acrylics, you definitely don't want to use your paint too thickly. You always want it to feel watered down. Appropriate substrates for using acrylics and watercolor are the same for using actual watercolor paints. Watercolor paper, which I'm going to demonstrate on in just a minute. This is watercolor paper. is the most common. Preparation of the paper should be the same as for using regular watercolors too. So if you're using a 140-pound or lighter weight paper, it needs to be soaked and stretched in order to prevent buckling while you were working. Although I admit that if I know my application for the paint will be light and not covering too much surface area, then I skip the step of soaking and stretching. And that's usually for illustration work. And you see I'm going to be working on an illustration right here. For heavier paper, use your best judgment. It is always better to use some paper or a small bit of supplies as test pieces than to wait and find out that you should have stretched your paper after you've put several hours of work into the piece and it starts buckling up just terribly. So how to soak and stretch your watercolor paper is a whole lesson in itself. So I'm not going to go over it right now, but you can find videos online and instructions in most watercolor books for how to soak and stretch your paper. And there are lots of other substrates for watercolor on the market now that do not need to be stretched. There are watercolor boards, watercolor canvases, clay and scratch boards that can have watercolor on them, plastic-based papers like Yupo. If they work with regular watercolors, you can use them with acrylics as watercolors too. So I'm going to get a sample here. This is actually just 90-pound weight paper. I started out just doing a little teeny bit in the middle that I was just going to show you, and it turned it into an entire illustration. So this really should have been soaked and stretched first, but it's such a little piece that I'm hoping that even though it'll probably buckle a little bit while I'm putting the paint on it, that as it dries, it will as it dries, it'll flatten out again, because sometimes it happens if it's small enough. Right up to the edge, so I need something underneath of it. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and paint this and fast forward the video while I do it, just so you can watch me work with the acrylics as watercolor. Oh, before I start fast forwarding, my pen I used on here was a Copic Multiliner 0.03. It's waterproof and Copic marker, other Copic marker proof. I love these for illustration. All right. Acrylics used as glaze or impasto, which is bumpy, are more traditional ways of using the paints that mimic the way oil paints are used. Glazing involves layering many coats of paint thinned with water or glazing medium to create depth and subtle color changes. This is the sort of painting that you will see on photorealistic work and detailed portraiture. It can be quite time-consuming, but is also rewarding. While water can be used to thin the paint, glazing, this is glazing medium, and slow dry mediums can help the paint to blend more smoothly and be workable for a longer period of time. Even with slow drying medium, the acrylic paint will still dry very quickly compared to an oil paint. Minutes for the acrylic paint compared to hours or days for the oil paint. But that slowing is often enough with a technique called, to get similar results to the slower drying oil paint. Glazing is often used with a technique called grisé, which is a monotone underpainting used to set the values of a painting. The substrate needs to be non-absorbent. Here again, I'm just using a quick piece of acrylic paper just to do the samples. But it needs to be non-absorbent. Gessoed canvas. Let's see. This is a finished painting, but stretched canvas. It was pre-gessoed. It still is on the back. Let me get it in there. So gessoed canvas, wood board, canvas board, painting on canvas board, and it was also pre-gessoed. And you can also gesso paper, which I'm going to show you how to do in just a second. And acrylic paper is also an option, and it does not have to be gessoed before you use acrylic paper. And this one I did not gesso. It's not my favorite substrate either, but I'm using it for these samples. So I'm going to give you a quick example of how it looks when you use the Grisaille. This I did. Just a quick sketch of an apple using some artist grade burnt umber paint. Burnt umber? No, raw umber. And that's what I use a lot of the time. Grisaille actually means gray, and traditionally that would be using just gray, but in modern usage it gets combined with some different colors sometimes. So this is a raw umber Grisaille of this apple. And it's all completely dry. I've got my, figuring out which one is which. I'm going to use, oops, sorry, didn't get that in there. A little bit of the red paint I have from before. I'm going to add some glossing medium to just a puddle next to it. And just, you can, so I just usually use these interchangeably. You can glaze just using the slow blending medium by itself, or you can mix them together. I'll put them both down so you can see them. They're different brands. They're slightly different colors and textures. So you can blend your paint. The glazing medium. And come in, it makes a very thin coat. And to build up all the color you need or want, you can glaze many layers over this. I'm just working very quickly here. I would work much slower and more carefully if this was anything more than just a quick demonstration. I would also try to stay in the lines if this was more than a quick demonstration. Alright, so then you come back and paint this apple and glaze it with my base coat here. Excuse that noise. My cats are sitting by the fireplace having a grand wrestling match while I'm trying to film. Okay, now I'm going to want doing this, make a little yellow glaze, very light to show you, maybe a little bit of a drop. Okay, I haven't let this dry. You would normally, but then you'd come over, say you want it a little bit yellow, light in that area, and just layer and layer and layer. Get a little yellow over the leaf. And that's how layering and glazing, you'd use those mediums to thin your paint and allow you to build up many translucent layers. Gesso comes in different forms. The three most common are white, clear, and black. I have white right here. If you buy a pre-gessoed substrate, like the stretched canvas or canvas board, a lot of times wood boards can come pre-gessoed too. There's usually no reason to add more gesso unless you really need to change the surface. Adding more, it just adds another layer of work for you. Occasionally a pre-gessoed surface may be too shiny for your taste, so you might want to add a different gesso to it that's a little less shiny, or you may want to make the surface smoother by adding more gesso, and you can do that by adding more. If you start with a raw surface, like a unfinished piece of wood, a piece of masonite, or a piece of paper like this, I have a piece of watercolor paper here, or illustration board, or something like that, you're going to need to gesso the surface to make it not water soluble, make it non-absorbent. So how you get the gesso onto the surface is a matter of preference. I like to use a brayer. To do it, and I like to add several thin coats. And you can do it all in one direction, or you can do it in alternating directions. I usually just go all in one direction. See, I just roll it on like this. It's nice and smooth. I did go a different direction this time. But I just roll it until there's no directional lines visible in it. Now this, you can see this is buckling. This is 90-pound paper, and normally I would use at least 140-pound, usually 300-pound to do this, so that I don't need to worry about it if it's like this. See, this should have been stretched, just like we talked about with watercolor paper. But for the demonstration, it'll be fine. Now, if you plan on doing highly detailed photorealistic work, then you might want several thin and very careful layers of the gesso. And then you take a really high, this is 400, but I would recommend going up to 600 or 800, which you can get if you have trouble finding super fine grain sandpaper. Try looking at your in the auto detailing section, like an auto supply store. They have it. But use that super fine grain and sand each layer of your gesso so it's super, super duper flat and there's no texture to interfere with your photorealistic work if that's what you're doing. If you're doing heavy impasto piece, then just getting your gesso on the surface in whatever manner feels good to you is fine, just as long as it's thoroughly covered, because there's going to be so much texture in it. A little texture in your gesso is not going to make any difference in your painting. Most of the time, you'll want something in between the two. You want it neat, but you might not need the whole need to sand, but you might want it, you might still want it neat enough that you don't need to worry about too much texture, and that's what this is right now. Impasto work is heavier than, much heavier than the glazing, and it's got lots of body and texture. And you can sample here. This is just regular artist grade paint applied kind of heavily, and this is the exact same paint mixed with some impasto medium. Acrylic naturally levels out to a smooth finish as it dries, and you can see how much smoother that is. To get the impasto look and feel, you must use a medium to make the body of your paint heavier. The names range from impasto medium, heavy bodied medium, medium or heavy gel medium. Those also work to make an impasto finish. They also come in different weights and textures for different effects. And usually where you buy it, there's like a chart that shows you the different samples, because there's all different kinds, and different kinds come out at different times. To use them, you mix some paint and medium together. That's it. It takes experimentation to find just the right texture for what you want. If you need a thicker texture than what you seem to be getting, you can add more medium to it up to a point, or it starts to weaken your color too much. There will be a maximum amount of effect you can get from a medium. If you need it to be thicker, at that point you need to buy a heavier medium. So this one's pretty heavy. You can get the heavy in the medium gel mediums. So like if you're using a medium gel medium and it wasn't bumpy enough for you, you might need to go up to the heavy, or the extra heavy. You can see how the bumpy this one is. You can also combine acrylic mediums. So adding glazing or slow drying mediums will thin down a thicker medium. So if you decided that this was too bumpy, you only wanted a little thinner and didn't want to get a lighter weight impasto medium, you can just add a little bit of glazing medium or slow drying medium. The slow drying medium will also give you a longer working time with it. And really, the vast majority of acrylic mediums serve one of two purposes. So you go and you look, and there's going to be a ton of different mediums, but they all serve one of three purposes. Sorry. To make the paint thinner, the glazing medium. Make the paint thinner, make your paint thicker, or make your paint dry slower. For impasto, you want thicker and sometimes slower drying. What's called alla prima painting, or painting where you put all of your color down in one layer on the substrate, is often done with an impasto technique. All of the same substrates appropriate for glazing with acrylics will work for impasto as well. Just make sure your substrate is strong enough to support the weight of your paint. I probably wouldn't use like too light a paper or something for it. Use something with some good bulk to it so it can support the weight of the impasto, especially as your painting grows and gets heavier. The thicker gels like the impasto are also popular in mixed media work for adding texture. You can use objects or rubber stamps to essentially cast impressions into a layer of the impasto medium. Let me show you that. Here's what it looks like inside. This one's kind of old and glumpy. Okay. Just using a piece of scratch paper here. Okay. So making a thick layer here. And I'm going to take a foam stamp. You can use rubber stamps. You can push right into it. Try not to wiggle it around too much because it'll smear. It's straight back up. Okay, and it made an impression there. It's a little hard to see. But there's a butterfly impression there when it's dry. I can go back in, add some color to that, and it'll show up more. You can also use something like this. This is from the cake decorating department. You can use it to spread around and make textures. And one thing to watch out for when using acrylic paints or acrylic mediums thickly is that you keep it thin enough that it will eventually dry. And all of this is thin enough it'll eventually dry, but if you start getting like up big, like a ½ an inch thick or so, it just won't dry. The top layer will dry, but then it'll leave the inside on wet. Some of the expressionist work by Pollock, for example, has been a nightmare for the conservationists because they have found thick pockets of acrylic paint that even now, decades after its creation, have never dried. They're still, the top layer is all dry, but when they go in from behind, they find that the paint is still sealed in there wet, and they have to remove it from behind with a syringe and replace it with some filler that will dry. For the same reason, it's important to never use acrylic paint on top of oil paint. It's perfectly fine to use acrylic gesso and underpaint in acrylics, and then to finish on top with oil paint, as long as the oil's on top. But never put acrylic over oil. The acrylic will dry quickly and make a seal over the oil paint, preventing the oil paint from ever drying. So as long as the oil paint is on top is on fine. As long as the oil paint is on top, you are fine. Thank you for joining me for this lesson. I'll see you next month.